I want to talk about grief this morning, and I also want to talk about a few of the tools that we have in our practice to meet this strong emotion. So let's start with grief. The Romans knew something about grief when they came up with the root of this word we use to describe loss. And what they knew was that grief is heavy, physically heavy. The Latin root gravis means heavy. And it's a shared root with other words that imply heaviness, like gravity and gravitas, grave. So when we're aggrieved by loss, we're made to feel heavy. And I've noticed this with some of the people that I've worked with. A typical physical reaction when someone gets the news that a loved one has died is they fall to their knees. I've seen this over and over again, this, and then the weight of it knocks you down. So this grief, it has real weight in our lives. It's a physical reality. Physical reality. And we don't show it. We try not to show it because it might indicate some sort of a weakness on our part. One of my grandfather teachers, Stephen Levine, said, if sequestered pain made a sound, the world will be humming all the time. Because we're all carrying this weight. So moving through this experience of grief too quickly is a problem because it allows it to scab over before it's healed from the inside. And we know that from a physical wound, if we allow something to scab over too soon, it can trap infection within the body instead of letting the body heal in a way that can support the whole body's health. And we do that sometimes with grief. We want to scab it over too quickly. And even in our Zen practice, if we misunderstand our Zen practice, we can use Zen to scab over our grief too quickly. So for instance, we might think, well, I'm a good practitioner. I shouldn't feel sad. I shouldn't feel emotional. I shouldn't be a wreck under the weight of this grief. And so we scab it over. We say, I'm okay. I'm doing fine. I'm doing okay. When we aren't. We call this spiritual bypass. We're bypassing what's actually happening so that we can appear to be spiritually okay. So even our Zen sometimes might encourage us to scab over too quickly. But it's important that we leave this wound open for the appropriate amount of time so it can heal from within instead of be constricted from without. And a lot of times our circumstances, maybe our family culture, our external culture, can push us towards this too quick scabbing of our grief. And then it becomes what we call in the grief work a complicated grief. The grief itself starts to be the problem as opposed to the loss. It becomes complicated. And we have rituals of grieving that hold this wound open long enough so that it can heal from within. And our rituals transform this loss from a source of fear into a source of meaning. And it helps us see that when we are grieving something, that the loss itself is an opening to seeing the preciousness of life. We don't want to rush past that. As Oscar Wilde said, where there is sorrow, there is holy ground. And we want to stand on the holy ground for the appropriate amount of time. And Francis Weller has written some really great books on the grieving process. And I'd like to bring forward a little bit of one of his ideas. He talks about the gates of grief. And I want to talk about two of the 5 gates that Francis talks about, but 2 that are important to us in this context. So the first gate of grief is grieving the loss of what we love. Grieving the loss of what or who we love. And this is the most easily recognizable grief. It's what we usually think of when we think about grief. So we may have lost a person that we love. Or we may have lost a dream for our future that we love. Or maybe how about an object that we love, a home that we've treasured, or an heirloom. You know, I think about the folks that have been through these wildfires and how the wildfire comes and burns up everything they owned. That's a real loss. That's a loss of things they love. The grandma's photo album that they no longer have. The childhood work that they saved from their kids when they were in the 1st grade. You know, all that's gone. And that's grief when that goes. We might also lose an idea that's important to us, like the idea of our safety, for instance. We might lose that. The idea of the cohesiveness of my family or my community, I might lose that. A lot of us have lost that recently. The idea that our communities are safe places. Our politics are so childish nowadays. Or maybe one of the things we've lost that we love are cultural values that we've held dear, that have somehow been incinerated recently. Things like kindness or truthfulness or togetherness. Many of us have experienced that these things have been destroyed in the same way fire destroyed objects. Our political fire has destroyed some of these wonderful cultural values that we hold. So it hurts. It really hurts. It's a great weight to carry. And we're surprised when it happens. But maybe we shouldn't be surprised. Because, you know, it says in one of our sutras, all that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. We know this is coming, but still, it hits us. We want to believe the illusion that things are permanent. And especially the things and the people that we love are permanent. Please take anything but her. Please take anything but that. And so we carry this great weight of grief when it happens. So I said this is maybe the most common type of grief, or what we think of when we think of with grief. But there's a little bit of a subset of this kind of grieving. Because in this losing someone or something we love, we think that it's complete. We lose that whole person, or we lose that whole thing. But sometimes it's partial. Sometimes we only lose part of someone, but not all of them. Maybe due to illness. Dementia is one of the ways that this happens a lot. We lose part of someone, but not the whole person. Or we lose part of something that we love. It's broken. It's not quite the same. But we can still grieve that too. And I think it's particularly insidious that we fail to recognize these kinds of grief because we think, well, I can grieve if how can I grieve when I still have so much, or I've still got this left, or we try and talk ourselves out of seeing that we've actually lost something important when it was a partial loss. So again, we should open our hearts to feeling that and not push it down. So going back to Rome here, a little poem by Emmanuel of Rome written millennia ago. He wrote, "'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. To love, to hope, to dream, and oh, to lose. A thing for fools this love, but a holy thing to love what death can touch. For your life has lived in me. Your laugh once lifted me. Your word was a gift to me. To remember this brings painful joy. 'Tis a human thing to love, a holy thing to love, what death can touch." Emmanuel of Rome. So let's take a pause right here. And I'd like to invite you to take out your paper and your writing instrument. And if you could take a few minutes here to hold in your heart that which you've loved and lost recently, whether that's a person or an object or an idea. And let's make it visible by writing it down. And after you've taken a few moments to write down your losses, the things that you've loved and lost, take a look at that list. Sit with that list and feel what it is that you feel. There's no right or wrong thing to feel. Just see what it is that you feel so that you know. So again, let's take a few moments to hold in our hearts the objects or people that we have loved and lost. And then after you've had a chance to write some things down, spend some time taking a look at that list and feel what it is that you feel. Okay, and I'll leave you to that for a bit. Okay, well, we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about what's come up later on, so we won't do that now. But thanks for being willing to do that. Let's go to the next gate of grieving, and that is grieving your own losses. For every visible loss that happens, there are many, many hidden losses that occur. The world recognizes the visible losses, the people that are being killed in Ukraine, the horrible amount of death in Gaza and Israel right now. We recognize those things. We see those things, more or less. But those of us who are left behind are much less recognized. For every one of those visible losses, the left behind are the loved ones, the caregivers, the community members, the survivors. So many more of those people than their, quote, victims that are lost. For every victim, there's probably dozens and dozens of people left behind that are grieving their own loss, not just the person that's gone. When you're left behind, you might be grieving many things. Maybe you're grieving the loss of a person who's both here and not here. Like I mentioned earlier, happens so much in partners of fading health. They're here and they're not here, or in dementia. That's a real loss for you as well. You may be left grieving a lost sense of us. You know, that the us in because of a weakening relationship, or maybe because a friend that you've not found your way to forgive. Or maybe you've had to draw a boundary and put up a boundary in a relationship that existed before. There's real grief in there for us, for you, the one who's remaining. Maybe in the face of someone's visible loss, you're left grieving your hopes for the future. You may be grieving the hopes of lost hopes for the future because of your own aging, for instance. You're not as energetic or as able. The things you thought you were going to do, you realize, I'm not going to be able to do. Or maybe you're grieving your own loss because you see the world changing around you, and it feels like maybe there's not room for you anymore. Not room for your kind of person, or your dreams, or your skills. I think a lot of people are having anticipatory grief right now when they look at artificial intelligence. They think, oh my gosh, this is going to take away my most beloved contribution to the world. Whether that's mathematics or engineering or many, many things, people are afraid they might lose. Maybe you're grieving your own loss from before this event happened, whatever this event might be. Maybe that event brought a loss of some ability that you have. Maybe that event was some sort of a natural disaster. Your very environment has changed. I think many of us are doing that with climate change right now. We're seeing, oh my gosh, I can't live in the forest like I love because my house might burn down. Or those parts of the world that I used to enjoy are now so hot I can't go there. And all those people that are displaced might be coming to live where I live. A lot of us are grieving in this way over the pandemic. This sense of togetherness that we had has been shattered. We're now wary of each other. We stand back from each other. We mask ourselves off from each other. There's grief there for something that we've lost. Or maybe grief for your own loss is your fading independence. You know, we're raised, a lot of us were raised in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where the focus was on being strong and independent. And as we're getting older, we're realizing we're anything but independent. We are dependent on each other. And that cultural message still resonates in us. I should be independent. But the reality is I'm not. So the things you might have treasured doing on your own, now you need help for. I'm noticing this in myself. Every time I get up off my cushion, it's hard to stand back up. My legs hurt. I used to pop right off the cushion. Now I can't. I'm grieving that change. I think, oh my gosh, do I have to start sitting on a chair? No, that's not me. Or maybe you've lost your independence because of a financial reversal. Maybe this dream you had to live a financially independent life now shows itself to be false. That you won't be independent, you'll be dependent. I'm spending a lot of time talking about these different sorts of losses that might be happening to us because I think that we overlook them. We decline to see them so that we don't have to face them. But these losses are real. They are happening and they need to be recognized. We don't want to scab them over by pretending they don't exist. They exist. They're real. They're heavy. Let's take another break for some writing. So this time, it'll be very similar. We'll do the same thing, but a slightly different question. What I'd like you to write about this time is hold in your heart your own less visible losses. The first time we wrote about the ones we could see, and most of them were kind of out there. So I want you to turn your eye into your own heart and hold in your heart your own less visible losses. And again, make them visible by writing them down. And like last time, write some down. And I know you can't make an exhaustive list. You can't come up with everything. But after you've written some down and it feels complete, then put down your writing instrument and look at that list and feel what it is that you feel. And I'll come back and get you in a few minutes. Thank you for being willing to do that. That's not easy to do. I really appreciate your bravery. Now, let's move now to talking about how we practice with all this. So here we are, we've opened these feelings of grief. What does our practice tell us to do? Well, the first thing our practice tells us to do is exactly what we've been doing. Zen practice, again and again, encourages us to turn towards reality. Turn towards life as it actually is. And that's what we've been doing. We've been turning towards our grief. So practice encourages us to feel and allow this animal, physical experience of grief. And when we allow it, it can take its natural course. Grief has a natural course that's different for everyone and for every loss. And it has the wisdom to know what to do when. Our job is simply to allow it to happen, to go along for the ride, trusting that there's wisdom even in these feelings that we don't like. The alternative is to suppress it. And when we do that, it metastasizes. And I saw so much of this in my healthcare work, particularly in the cancer center when I worked there. There was so much unrecognized grief among the staff, and it ate people up. It metastasized into all kinds of juvenile behaviors among each other. It was so sad to witness. So it's hard to do, but when we turn towards our grief, we also turn towards our joy. It may not feel like it at first, but feeling grief allows us to feel everything else that we feel, which includes joy and love and happiness and awe. But shutting down to not feel grief also shuts down those other things. We become dulled and unalive. I want to share with you a photograph of a person. Can you see that okay? So this is my wife's grandmother, Jessie Young. And you can probably see from the look on her face that when you see her, you just want to smile. She was an absolutely amazing person. She was probably 103 when I took this photograph of her, and she lived to be 105. And she had such joy about her. You might think that a person that has that kind of joy had an easy life, but she did not have an easy life. She was born in Honolulu in Chinatown in 1903, and a few months after she was born, her father was killed by a business associate who wanted to steal the land that he had. And in the house in which she lived, they had a temple, a Taoist temple, and it burned to the ground not long after her father died. So they lost their home, they lost all their possessions, they lost their income. She lost her father. And she made her way through her life, and it was a difficult life. It was not a financially easy life, but they built two small houses next to each other, one for themselves, she and her husband and their two children, and one for his parents and all of his siblings, because it was her husband's responsibility in Chinese culture to support his family, his parents, and his siblings. And they did that, and they never complained. They were proud to do that. And there wasn't a time when we didn't visit her that she didn't send us home with a little red envelope with something in it. And she just didn't have very much at all. But every time she sent us home with $100 in an envelope. It was amazing. So I'm sharing this picture of her because it upends my idea that an easy life breeds joy. Her life was filled with a lot of grief. You know, she outlived all the people that she knew. She outlived her siblings. She outlived all of her children. She outlived all of her children's generation. She lost everybody. And there's that smile. There's that smile. Amazing. One of the things I think that helped support Jessie in her transforming her grief into joy is that she was held in a whole set of rituals that allowed her to make sense of her grieving. In this Hawaiian Chinese culture, there's all kinds of rituals going on all the time. And we've inherited those too. Our Zen rituals can help us greatly in holding our grief. We have rituals for opening the sensations of grieving. When someone dies, we hold memorial services, we hold wakes, we get together, we share potlucks, we sit together, we view the bodies of people who have died. These are really important, and we have these in Zen. And we also have the ceremonies for closing that experience of grief. In Zen, we have the 49th day ceremony, where after 49 days, we say, we have felt this. We have felt this. And now it's time to honor this person by moving on with life, bringing them with us in our hearts. We don't get stuck. We move on. I remember one time when at in Mindfulness Community of Puget Sound, we lost a beloved Sangha member. And so we opened the grieving with a ceremony, and she had a lot of accoutrements that she had on her cushion. And we left her cushion and all her things there for 49 days. And at the end of 49 days, we packed all those things up and we put them away. And we put out in the garden, the memorial garden, a rock with her name on it to remind us. But we didn't leave the things there forever. We knew it was time to move forward. So we might want to think about that, because I think our use of rituals has gone kind of weak. We might want to think about, as a Sangha, how do we want to do this? Because all of us, all the time, are losing. And how do we want to support each other? And it's a conversation that I hope we'll begin to have. I hope we'll begin to have this conversation. I want to be supported of myself when my friends are dying. I want to feel that support from the Sangha. So I want to have this conversation. Okay, well, I was planning to talk a little bit about equanimity, but I think I might have just gone on a little too long. Maybe it's time for me to stop here, unless you think that I should keep going. What's the Sangha sense here? To go more? Yeah, more. I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about another major tool that we have in our Zen practice for dealing with grief, and that is equanimity. Our first step, of course, is turning toward the losses, but that's not enough. It's not enough to turn toward them, because we might be overwhelmed by the suffering that we find when we turn toward that difficulty. It's okay to feel overwhelmed by that. When we in the grieving profession work with people that are grieving, what we look for is, are people flowing and changing as the grief flows and changes? Or are we stuck? If a person can only experience grief in one way, it might be a sign that they're stuck. So it's not enough just to turn towards it. So how about I tell a little story about someone who faced this? It might be a story that you already know, but I think that's one of the rituals we do. We tell familiar stories. So this might be a familiar story to you. And this is the story of Kisa Gotami. And Kisa Gotami was a young woman who lived at the time of the Buddha. And things were going really well for her. She had this nice house right by this river, and she had a loving husband, and she had a little baby boy that was healthy, that she adored. And she lived with her in-laws, as was very common in her culture at that time. And her in-laws were kind to her. Her life was going really well. You know, she had the equivalent of the Indian dream of that time. It's like we talk about having the American dream in our time. She had the Indian dream. And one day, completely unexpectedly, down the river came a wall of water and debris, and it washed away everything. It washed away her house, her family. It washed away her. And in this terrible event, this tumbling around, she found herself ejected back onto the bank. And she pulled herself together, as covered with mud, and got herself together and ran back to find her beloved people and her beloved things. And they were all gone. Eventually, she found the body of her baby son. And she picked this boy's body up out of the mud. And she was absolutely overcome with grief. She was driven mad with grief. She wandered holding this little muddy infant in her arms. She was completely naked, coated with mud, hysterical, mad, unintelligible. And she remained this way for some time, and the other people in the village were very concerned about her. And one of the people knew that the Buddha was nearby with the Sangha in the forest. And they said, let's take Gisa Gautami to the Buddha. Maybe the Buddha can help her. And so the villagers led her to the Buddha. And she poured out her grief in front of the Buddha and told the story and held on to this mud-covered little dead infant in her arms. And the Buddha listened. And he listened. And when she was done, he said, I think I can help you. He said, it's very simple. All you need to do is go to the village and find a house that has an extra sesame seed and bring it back to me. So she thought, okay. And so they gave her some clothing, and she went back. Stood up to go back to the village, and the Buddha said, oh, just one more thing. That sesame seed has to come from a house that's not experienced loss. So Gisa Gautami started this task, and she went house to house, and she would knock on the door and tell them that she's looking for a sesame seed, and tell them that it has to come from a house with no loss. And they'd say, oh, my dear, my husband died a year ago. I can't give that to you. And the next house, oh, I've lost 3 babies. And it was like that, house after house after house. And eventually she saw that there was not a single house untouched by loss. And so she went back to the Buddha carrying her baby, and she cried. She felt her loss. And the Sangha buried her baby, and she became a nun. And she transformed that loss into tremendous insight and compassion. I think what the Buddha was doing there was teaching in a very real and simple way equanimity. He was not denying Gisa Gautami's loss. That was huge. She lost everything, and that was real. And at the same time, he wanted her to see that this is the way it is for human beings. This is the way it is for all of us. Everyone in her village had experienced loss. So equanimity becomes our response to grief and loss. Equanimity is the middle ground that both recognizes that suffering is real and transforms our suffering into compassion. Equanimity prevents us from denying our grief on one hand and getting lost in our grief on the other hand. And we tell the story of Gisa Gautami, because she's the one that got lost in her grief, but I'll bet we could tell that story a lot more about those of us who deny our grief. It's just the other end of the spectrum. So equanimity is this quality of moving through the world with an open heart. And again, one of our sutras says, the Sutra on Happiness, to live in the world with your heart undisturbed by the world, this is the greatest happiness. To live in the world, to feel it all, and at the same time, to have your heart undisturbed by it all. This is the greatest happiness. And for those of us that were at Morning Light Sangha this morning, our direction from Margaret was to contemplate how to move through the world without losing our identity, as Ty did. And I think this is pointing in a similar direction. With equanimity, we feel it all, but we aren't lost in it. And equanimity is not about failing to care or becoming detached. It's engagement with reality. It's engagement with reality. And it's engagement with reality in a way that allows this kind of steadiness in us. And this is love. This is love. To be in the world with our heart undisturbed by the world, that's love, because we understand what's happening and it doesn't sweep us away. There's two qualities of equanimity that I'd like to mention. And the first one is equanimity as a mature observer. We embody equanimity when we become a mature observer. And this is really Kisa Gotami's story. She transforms from an immature observer to a mature observer. So the immature observer says, I'm the only one who's ever had this loss. And the mature observer says, we've all had this loss. I am just like everyone else. Mature observer sees things as they are. Mature observer sees that gain and loss happen every single moment of our lives, always happening. Sees that everything's impermanent, that nothing is separate, that the true end is present here and now. This is the mature observer. Can see the events, but also see the deeper truth that holds all of these events. And that's Kisa Gotami's story, is her moving toward that mature observer. And we too can become mature observers, but I don't think we should wait until we get a cancer diagnosis to start working on this, right? Maybe part of why it was difficult for Kisa Gotami to become a mature observer was because her life was so easy and she didn't have to work on these things when they were small and manageable. She got the crash course, or maybe the flood course. But we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for the disaster to strike us. We can look around us and see it happening all the time. We can see that summer dies so that autumn is born. There it is, teaching us. We see that our own children have to lose the preciousness of childhood so that they can step into their maturity. There's loss and gain right there in our lives. We can see that today's carrots are tomorrow's composts and next year's roses. There it is, gain and loss right in our lives. Please, let's not wait until the disaster strikes us to see this. Because when the disaster strikes us, we're going to need all the strength we have. And this will give us the strength. So that's the first quality of equanimity I want to mention, that the quality of being a mature observer. And the second one is the equanimity of open-heartedness. Open-heartedness. And that means being able to live in the middle of life without reacting to all of the things that come our way. So let's draw a distinction here between responding and reacting. Reacting is we feel something, we believe it's true, and we react. Someone pulls out in front of us in their car, we know they're a jerk, and we flip them off. That's reacting. But responding is different. Responding is we feel something, And when then we then allow the experience to be there, and we get to respond as the mature observer, respond as the person who sees more deeply. So when the person pulls out in front of me, sure, I feel the anger, but I take a moment and I realize that, this is what it means to drive a car. We make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. And then I don't flip them off. I say, there goes me. Right there. I've done that to people before. I got to see this recently when I was on an airplane and I sat in the middle seat, and two very large people sat on either side of me. And these large people flowed into my seat, right? My space. And I didn't have armrests. I was pinned literally by these two large people on either side. And so at first I thought, oh, poor me. Here I am. This is awful. I don't want to sit here in this kind of situation. But as I sat there for a while, I realized it was kind of a bumpy flight and the plane was going like this a lot. I realized I've got this great padded seat. I got to sit between these two people and get held in place. So while everyone else was rocking back and forth, I was like, this is nice. It's nice and warm and cozy right here in my padded seat. So the equanimity of open-heartedness gives us this ability to move through life without feeling like a victim, to see as a mature observer and see the bigger picture. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there.